The settlement of Port Mercy clung to the edge of civilization like barnacles to a ship's hull. It was neither grand nor prosperous, merely a collection of weathered structures huddled against the Caribbean wind, where merchants too desperate or too foolish ventured to trade with pirates who ruled these waters. The bay curved like a crescent moon, its waters deceptively calm, hiding the treacherous rocks beneath that had claimed dozens of vessels over the years. On the northernmost edge of the settlement, where the beach gave way to wild palmetto groves and tangled vines, a solitary figure worked under the relentless sun. Her name was Elara Thorne, though few in Port Mercy bothered to learn it. To them, she was simply the widow's daughter, the woman fool enough to believe she could carve out a life in this forsaken place. Her hands, calloused and bleeding in places, gripped a piece of driftwood she'd salvaged from the tide. She wedged it between two posts driven deep into the sand, creating the frame of what would become her shelter. Her dress, once a respectable grey cotton, now hung in tatters around her ankles, stained with salt and sweat. Dark hair escaped from beneath a faded kerchief, curling wildly in the humid air. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who had no choice but to succeed. Behind her, the few possessions she owned sat bundled in a salt-stained canvas: a cooking pot, a knife, 2 blankets, and a leather-bound journal that had belonged to her mother. Everything else, the comfortable home in Charleston, the servants, the respect of society, had vanished like morning mist when her father's shipping business collapsed and creditors seized everything they could touch. "Foolish woman," came a voice from the settlement, carried on the breeze. Elara didn't turn. She'd grown accustomed to the whispers, the judgment. A woman alone was either a whore or a madwoman in places like this, and she'd proven herself neither willing to sell her body nor mad enough to abandon her dignity entirely. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that building this shack meant survival. It meant having 4 walls between herself and the men who looked at her with hunger in their eyes. It meant having a door she could bar at night when the pirates came ashore, drunk and dangerous. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Elara paused to wipe the sweat from her brow, her gaze sweeping across the bay. That's when she saw him. A ship sat anchored in the deeper waters beyond the reef, a brigantine with black sails furled against her masts. Even at this distance, Elara could sense the vessel's predatory grace, the way she sat in the water like a hunting cat waiting to pounce. The Morning Star, the locals called her, though always in hushed tones. Her captain was a man whose very name seemed to drain the color from men's faces. Captain Dominic Ashford. Elara had heard the stories, as everyone in Port Mercy had. A British naval officer turned pirate after his wife and infant daughter were killed in a Spanish raid on his estate in Jamaica. Some said he'd gone mad with grief, burning every Spanish vessel he encountered, showing no mercy to their crews. Others whispered that he was searching for something, redemption perhaps, or death itself. But what struck Elara now, as she stood with driftwood still clutched in her bleeding hands, was the figure standing at the ship's rail. Even from this distance she could sense his gaze upon her. He was tall, his coat dark against the fading light, and he stood with the stillness of a man who had learned to watch, to wait, to calculate. She couldn't see his face, couldn't read his expression, but something in his posture spoke of loneliness so profound it seemed to echo across the water between them. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, they remained frozen, the pirate captain on his ship and the desperate woman on the shore, 2 souls separated by water and circumstance, yet somehow connected by the universal language of loss. Then Elara turned back to her work, driving another post into the sand with fierce determination. She had no time for pirates, no matter how tragic their stories. She had her own survival to secure. But as the darkness gathered, and she finally retreated to sleep beneath the stars, wrapped in her thin blankets with her knife clutched close, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Somewhere out in that bay, aboard the Morning Star, Captain Dominic Ashford stood vigil, his eyes trained on the tiny fire she'd built to ward off the night's chill. Chapter 2. The Storm That Changes Everything. 3 days passed. Elara's shack began to take shape. 4 walls of salvaged wood and palm fronds, a roof that would at least shed rain if not withstand a hurricane. She worked from dawn until dusk, her body aching, her hands raw. The settlement's residents gave her a wide berth, though their stares never ceased. The Morning Star remained anchored in the bay. Occasionally longboats would row to shore, disgorging pirates who swaggered through Port Mercy's muddy streets, spending their plunder on rum and women. But the captain himself never came ashore. He remained aboard his ship, a dark figure occasionally visible on the quarterdeck, always seeming to face toward the northern beach, where Ilara built her solitary refuge. On the fourth morning, the sky turned the color of old bruises. The wind shifted, coming now from the east, carrying with it the smell of rain and the electric promise of a storm. Ilara worked faster, trying to secure her roof before the weather broke. She'd survived storms before, one terrible hurricane that had nearly killed her during the voyage from Charleston, but never alone, never in a structure as fragile as this. The first drops fell as she hammered the final support beam into place. Within minutes, the rain became a deluge, driven horizontal by winds that seemed determined to tear her shack apart at its seams. Ilara huddled inside, water streaming through gaps in the roof, her blankets growing sodden, her fire drowned and cold. Thunder cracked like cannon fire. Through the gaps in her walls, she could see the bay transformed into a churning cauldron, waves crashing against the shore with murderous force. The Morning Star pitched and rolled, her anchor chains groaning under the strain. Then came the sound that froze Ilara's blood, the splitting crack of wood giving way. She looked up just as a section of her roof tore free, spinning away into the storm like a leaf. Rain poured through the opening, and the walls began to shudder, threatening to collapse entirely. She had to get out. Grabbing her canvas bundle, Ilara pushed through the door just as another gust slammed into the structure. She stumbled, fell to her knees in the mud, the rain so thick she could barely see 3 feet ahead. Behind her, the shack groaned one final time before collapsing in on itself, her 3 days of work reduced to kindling in seconds. Ilara screamed, though the sound was torn away by the wind. She tried to stand, to run toward the settlement, but her sodden skirts tangled around her legs and she went down again, this time unable to rise. Exhaustion, hunger, and despair crashed over her like the waves battering the shore. Perhaps it would be easier to simply surrender, to let the storm take her. "On your feet!" The voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Strong hands seized her arms, hauling her upward. Through the driving rain, Ilara found herself staring into a face carved from granite and shadows. Captain Dominic Ashford stood before her, his long dark coat plastered to his frame, water streaming from hair the color of mahogany. His eyes, grey as the storm-tossed sea, held hers with an intensity that stole what little breath she had remaining. "Can you walk?" His voice carried the cultured accent of a gentleman, incongruous coming from a man who now made his living through plunder and violence. Ilara nodded, though in truth, she wasn't certain. The captain didn't wait for further confirmation. He swept her into his arms as though she weighed nothing, turning toward the beach, where a longboat waited, 4 of his crew fighting to keep it from being dashed against the rocks. "No," Ilara struggled weakly. "My things are not worth your life." His grip tightened, not painfully but with absolute firmness. "Be still, or you'll get us both killed." The journey to the longboat was a nightmare of wind and rain and treacherous footing. Twice, the captain nearly lost his balance on the slick rocks, but he never loosened his hold on Ilara, never hesitated. His crew hauled them both into the boat, and then they were rowing hard for the Morning Star, fighting against waves that threatened to capsize them with every stroke. By the time they reached the ship, Ilara was shaking so violently she couldn't control her limbs. She barely registered being lifted aboard, carried below decks, deposited in a cabin that smelled of beeswax and leather, and the faint sweetness of rum. "Strip off those wet clothes before you catch your death." The captain's voice seemed to come from very far away. "There's a shirt and blankets in the chest. I'll send someone with hot food." Then he was gone, and Ilara was alone in the gently swaying cabin, water dripping from her hair, her body finally giving in to the delayed shock of everything she'd endured. She didn't remember changing clothes or wrapping herself in blankets, but when she next opened her eyes, dawn light filtered through the porthole. The storm had passed and she lay in the captain's own bed, wearing a shirt that smelled of salt and smoke and something indefinably masculine. On the small table beside the bed sat a tray: bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a cup of water. And beneath the tray, carefully placed, was her canvas bundle, somehow salvaged from the wreckage of her shack. Ilara pressed her hand to her mouth, tears finally coming, hot and unstoppable. A pirate captain, a man whose reputation spoke of ruthlessness and violence, had risked his life and his crew to save a woman he didn't know, a woman who had nothing to offer in return. Through the cabin wall, she could hear his voice giving orders, directing repairs to the storm damage. It was a voice accustomed to command, yet underneath its steel, she detected something else: a weariness, a loneliness that matched her own. Chapter 3. The Compass That Points Home. The Morning Star remained at anchor for 2 more days, while her crew made repairs and waited for the winds to favor their departure. During that time, Ilara existed in a strange limbo, neither prisoner nor guest, neither accepted nor rejected. The captain had given her his cabin while he slept elsewhere, likely in the cramped quarters with his officers. She saw him occasionally on deck, always at a distance, always watching with those storm-grey eyes that seemed to see too much. His crew, a motley assembly of English deserters, freed slaves, and Caribbean natives, treated her with a wary respect that confused her, until she overheard 2 sailors talking. "Cap'n hasn't shown interest in a woman since the missus died," one said, his voice low. 7 years, and not once. But he near broke his neck in that storm to save this one. "Aye," replied the other. "Maybe he sees something in her, a second chance, perhaps." Ilara's cheeks burned. She retreated back to the cabin, her mind churning. A second chance at what? Love? Family? She was a penniless woman with nothing to offer, while he was a pirate captain with a price on his head. The very idea was absurd. Yet that evening, when a soft knock came at the cabin door, her heart leapt in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Enter!" she called, smoothing the borrowed shirt she still wore, having no other clothes. Captain Ashford stepped inside, and for the first time she saw him clearly in lamplight rather than storm and shadow. He was perhaps 35, with lines of care etched around his eyes and mouth. His hair, dark brown shot through with premature grey, was tied back with a leather cord. He moved with the unconscious grace of a man utterly comfortable at sea, and when he closed the door, the small cabin seemed to shrink around them. "Miss Thorne." He inclined his head with a courtesy that belonged to drawing-rooms and ballrooms, not pirate ships. "I apologize for not speaking with you sooner. The ship required attention. You know my name." It wasn't a question. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Port Mercy is small, and sailors gossip worse than old women. I know you're recently arrived from Charleston, that your father's business failed, and that you chose to build a life here rather than accept charity or worse offers." Ilara lifted her chin. "And yet you also chose this place, Captain. A man with your skills could sail anywhere, take any prize. Why anchor in these waters?" The question seemed to strike something deep within him. He moved to the porthole, gazing out at the darkening sea. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "Because anywhere else I would be tempted to keep running. Here at the edge of everything I can almost pretend the past doesn't exist." He turned back to her, and the naked pain in his eyes stole her breath. "I watched you build that shack for 3 days, watched you refuse help, refuse to compromise, refuse to give up, even when any reasonable person would have. Do you know what that reminded me of?" "What?" The word emerged as barely a whisper. "Myself, before I lost everything that mattered." He took a step closer. "My wife, Catherine, was like you. Fierce, determined. She believed that will and work could overcome any obstacle. When the Spanish came, she fought them with a kitchen knife while trying to protect our daughter. They killed her for her courage." Tears sprang to Ilara's eyes. "Captain, I'm so sorry." "Dominic," he interrupted softly, "when we're here alone, call me Dominic. I've been Captain Ashford for so long I've nearly forgotten who I was before." He reached into his coat and withdrew something, a compass, old and brass, and worn smooth by constant handling. This belonged to Catherine. It was her grandfather's, given to her the day we married. I've carried it through every battle, every storm, every dark night when I considered simply sailing into the void and never returning." He held it out to Ilara. She took it with trembling hands, feeling the weight of it, the warmth from his body still clinging to the metal. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because for 7 years this compass has been my only connection to the idea of home. But tonight, holding it, I realized something." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. "A compass doesn't point to where you've been. It points to where you need to go." The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken possibilities. Ilara understood what he was offering, not just shelter aboard his ship, but something far more dangerous and precious. A chance to be part of something again, to belong to someone who understood loss and loneliness as intimately as she did. "Your crew," she said carefully, "they're more than just sailors to you. They're my family now. Every man aboard this ship was broken when I found him, by war, by slavery, by circumstance. We forged something here that the world above would never allow, a brotherhood built on loyalty rather than blood." He paused, and when he continued, his voice dropped to something almost tender. "But a family needs more than brotherhood, Ilara. It needs a heart, a center, someone who reminds us what we're fighting to preserve." "You're asking me to stay." It wasn't a question. "I'm asking you to consider it. I'm asking you to look at this ship, this crew, this life, and tell me if you see possibility where others see only piracy and danger." He gestured around the cabin. "I won't lie to you. This life is hard. We're hunted by navies and betrayed by our own kind. We live by codes, written in blood and honor. But we're also free in ways that those who live by society's rules can never be." Ilara looked down at the compass in her hands. In the lamplight, she could see an inscription on the back, "All roads lead home." Such a simple sentiment, yet it contained universes of meaning. Home wasn't a place, it was people. It was belonging. It was the feeling that had eluded her since the moment her father's debtors had stripped away everything she'd known. "I have nothing to offer you," she said finally. "No dowry, no skills beyond basic keeping of accounts, and you have courage." Dominic's voice cut through her self-doubt like a blade through silk. "You have will. You have the strength to stand alone when the world would see you broken. Those are the only things that matter aboard this ship." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had taken so many lives. "I'm not asking you to be what Catherine was. I'm asking you to be who you are, and to let me, be a place where you can finally stop fighting alone." A tear slipped down Ilara's cheek, and she didn't try to stop it. All her life, she'd been taught that a woman's worth lay in her family connections, her dowry, her ability to make a good match. But here, in this pirate captain's cabin, with the sea rocking gently beneath them, she was being offered something no gentleman in Charleston had ever given her, the chance to be valued for her spirit rather than her circumstances. "I need time," she whispered. "This is all so sudden, and take all the time you need." Dominic lowered his hand, though his eyes never left hers. "We sail in 2 days for the Windward Passage. If you wish to return to Port Mercy before then, I'll have you rowed ashore with enough gold to rebuild your shack 10 times over. But if you choose to remain—" He trailed off, leaving the promise unspoken but shimmering in the air between them like heat above sun-warmed boards. After he left, Ilara sat alone in the lamp-lit cabin, the compass still warm in her hands. Through the porthole, she could see stars emerging in the darkening sky, and below the gentle slap of waves against the hull sang a lullaby of possibility. Somewhere above her head, she heard Dominic's voice giving quiet orders to the night watch, and the sound wrapped around her heart like an anchor line, holding her steady for the first time since her world had collapsed. She thought of her mother's journal, tucked safely in her canvas bundle. The last entry, written days before fever took her, had contained a single line of advice. "Home is not where you're born, my darling. It's where your heart learns to beat in rhythm with others." Ilara pressed the compass to her chest and closed her eyes, listening to the ship's heartbeat, feeling the pull of something that might, if she was brave enough to reach for it, become the home she'd been searching for all along. Chapter 4. The flag that flies for Family Dawn broke clear and brilliant, painting the Caribbean in shades of turquoise and gold. Ilara emerged from the cabin to find the deck already alive with activity. Sailors scrubbed planks, checked rigging, and made the 1,000 small preparations necessary before a ship could safely put to sea. They worked with the synchronized efficiency of men who knew their lives depended on every knot, every sail, every rope being exactly where it needed to be. She stood at the rail, breathing in salt air and possibility, when a voice spoke beside her. "Sleep well, miss?" The speaker was an older man, his skin weathered dark by decades under the sun, his hair gone white as foam. He wore the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The first mate, she guessed. "As well as can be expected, given the circumstances," Ilara replied. "You are?" "Thomas Mackenzie, first mate of this vessel and the closest thing to a voice of reason the captain keeps around." His eyes, sharp and assessing, studied her with open curiosity. "You're the cause of considerable speculation among the crew, Miss Thorne. In 7 years, Captain Ashford hasn't brought a soul aboard without explicit purpose. You're the first exception. I didn't ask to be rescued. No, but you also didn't refuse the rescue." Mackenzie's lips quirked. "There's wisdom in that. Pride kills more sailors than storms, and I suspect the same holds true for those who build shacks on hurricane-prone beaches." Despite herself, Ilara smiled. "Point taken." "The captain's a good man," Mackenzie continued, his tone growing serious. "Best I've ever served under, and I sailed with the Royal Navy for 20 years before circumstances made that impossible. He could have become a monster after what happened to his family. Instead, he became something rarer, a man who understands that strength and gentleness aren't opposites. Why are you telling me this? Because I watched him these past 3 days. Watched him stand at that rail for hours, looking toward shore like a man trying to solve an impossible equation. And I haven't seen that look in his eyes since the early days after Catherine died. The look of someone who still believes tomorrow might be worth seeing." Mackenzie turned to face her directly. "Whatever you decide about staying or going, understand that it matters, not just to him, but to all of us. A captain's heart affects his entire crew, and this crew deserves a captain who remembers how to hope." Before Ilara could respond, Dominic appeared on the quarterdeck, calling out orders in a voice that carried effortlessly across the ship. He moved with absolute confidence, every gesture precise, every command obeyed instantly. This was a man in his element, she realized. Not the grieving widower who'd held a compass like a lifeline, but a leader who'd forged loyalty through competence and fairness. The day passed in a blur of activity and observation. Ilara watched how the crew interacted, the easy camaraderie, the shared jokes, the way they moved around each other with the fluid grace of long practice. She saw how Dominic knew every man's name, remembered details about their lives, praised good work and corrected mistakes without humiliation. This wasn't the brutal hierarchy she'd imagined aboard a pirate vessel. It was something closer to the family he'd described. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in colors of fire and blood, Dominic found her again at the rail. He said nothing at first, simply stood beside her, both of them watching the light fade from the world. "I've made my decision," Ilara said quietly. She felt rather than saw his tension, the way his entire body seemed to brace for whatever blow her words might deliver. "Tell me." Ilara turned to face him, and in the dying light she could see every line of care on his face, every mark left by loss and survival. He was beautiful in the way that broken things reassembled with care could be beautiful, stronger for having shattered and been made whole again. "When I was building that shack," she began, "I told myself I was creating a home, a place where I could be safe and independent. But the truth is I was just building walls between myself and the world, another kind of prison, even if I was the one who held the key." Dominic's eyes never left her face, his expression unreadable. "You asked me to look at this ship and see possibility. I've been watching, and do you know what I see?" She gestured to encompass the morning star and all who sailed her. "I see men who've found a way to matter again, to have purpose and dignity when the world tried to strip both away. I see a family built on choice rather than obligation. And I see a captain who carries a compass, not because he's lost, but because he never stopped believing in the idea of home." Ilara, his voice caught. Let me finish. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the compass, holding it up between them. You said this doesn't point to where you've been, but where you need to go. I think you're wrong. I think it's always pointed to the same place, toward the people who matter, toward family, toward love. She pressed the compass back into his hands, folding his fingers around it. And I think, if you'll have me, I'd like to help you find what you're searching for. For a long moment, Dominic stood frozen, the compass clenched in his fist, his eyes bright with emotions too complex to name. Then slowly, he raised his free hand to her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't known she'd shed. I can't promise you safety, he said, his voice rough. I can't promise you comfort or respectability. This life promises nothing but honesty and freedom, Ilara finished. I know, and that's more than I ever had in Charleston, where my worth was measured in dowries and family connections. Here I can be valued for who I am, not what I bring. You bring everything, Dominic whispered, everything that matters. Then he was kissing her, his lips gentle, despite the obvious hunger and the tension of his body. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and promises, of grief acknowledged and hope tentatively rekindled. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, the stars had begun to emerge overhead, and the crew had diplomatically turned their attention to suddenly urgent tasks on the opposite side of the ship. Mackenzie's voice carried across the deck. All hands. Captain's orders. Prepare to weigh anchor at first light. A cheer went up from the crew, and Ilara understood that this was more than approval of the sailing schedule. This was acceptance, welcome, the acknowledgement that their family had just gained a new member. That night, as the ship rocked gently at anchor for the last time before departure, Ilara stood at the bow with Dominic beside her. His arm encircled her waist, holding her steady as they gazed out at the dark horizon. Where will we sail? She asked. Wherever the wind takes us, wherever the compass points. He paused, then added softly, wherever feels like home. Ilara leaned into his warmth, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back, hearing the low voices of the crew going about their evening tasks, smelling the familiar scents of salt and tar and possibility. Above them, the Morning Star's black flag snapped in the night breeze, not a symbol of death and piracy, but of freedom hard-won and jealously guarded. She thought of the shack that had collapsed in the storm, of the life in Charleston that had crumbled just as completely, of all the versions of herself she'd tried and failed to be. None of it mattered now. She'd spent so long believing that home was something you built from wood and nails, something solid and permanent. But standing here, wrapped in a pirate captain's arms, while his crew sang bawdy songs on the deck below, she understood the truth her mother had tried to teach her. Home wasn't a place, it was people. It was belonging. It was the feeling of being known and valued and chosen, not despite your flaws, but because your flaws were part of what made you exactly who you needed to be. Dominic, she said softly. Yes? Thank you for watching, for waiting, for being brave enough to reach for something good, even when the world had taught you to expect nothing but pain. His arms tightened around her. Thank you for being brave enough to accept it. They stood together as the night deepened, as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, as the sea sang its eternal song of danger and possibility. Tomorrow they would sail for the Windward Passage, and beyond that, who knew what adventures and challenges awaited. But tonight, aboard the Morning Star, a pirate captain and a woman who'd lost everything had found what they'd both been searching for. Not treasure, not revenge, not escape. Simply this: a place to belong, a family to cherish, and the courage to believe that sometimes, when everything falls apart, it's only so that something better can be built from the pieces. The compass in Dominic's pocket pointed true north, as it always had. But now, for the first time in 7 years, he understood that north wasn't a direction. It was a person. It was the woman in his arms who'd rebuilt her strength from ruins, who'd chosen love over safety, who'd looked at his broken crew and seen not pirates but possibility. And when the Morning Star weighed anchor at dawn, carrying her crew toward whatever future awaited them, she flew not just the black flag of freedom, but something more precious: the invisible banner of a family reunited, a heart reawakened, and a love that had found its way home at last.